Welcome to UW Now Live. Tonight, we're looking at the forces shaping today's economy, from war to artificial intelligence. Our guests are experts on global economics and technical public policy. Patrick McDaniel is the Soon-Ming Shi Professor of Computer Sciences in the School of Computer Data and Information Sciences at UW-Madison, soon to be the College of Computing and Artificial Intelligence. Kim Ruhl is the Kurt and Sue Culver Professor of Economics and co-director of the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy. Most recently, he was a member of and the acting vice chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Donald J. Trump. The conversation will be moderated by your host, Mike Knetter.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us. This should be a very fascinating show tonight. We'll be talking about some of the major forces shaping the U.S. and global economy. First and foremost among those would be kind of the latest output of American capitalism, and that is the artificial intelligence revolution that is reshaping industries, how work is done, the labor market, and many other things. It's also driving equity markets and wealth creation in America in a very concentrated form of that, almost like we have never seen before. It's a very powerful but narrow revolution that's reshaping the economy. And then juxtaposed with that, we have some major policy changes that have come out of the Trump administration, which I tend to label under the heading of America First policies. Not all of those policies are necessarily aimed at economic policy, but they have economic consequences. And Kim Ruhl will be here with us tonight to talk about that. And Patrick McDaniel will be talking about the AI revolution. So, of course, we'll have a lot of questions for our guests, and we'd like to take your questions too. So please put them in the live chat. But let's begin our program tonight, starting off with Kim Ruhl, who is fresh off a stint in Washington, D.C., at the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Kim, it was a very busy time for economic policy, and it's really a pleasure to have you on the program to speak to that. Tell us what's going on in the economy on the policy front. What are the impacts that you see today?
Sure, Mike. Thanks for having me. And it was a great experience to bring the Wisconsin idea to the rest of the world and the rest of the world back to Wisconsin. So let's take a look at some slides here. Okay, so I think thinking about the economy as a whole, the whole world economy, not just the U.S., there are three big sets of forces at work right now. Obviously, there are other things, but I think these are the three big ones. The first and most immediate, of course, is the Middle East situation and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The second is a combination of things, some of which are being driven by U.S. policy and some by other policies that I'm going to call geoeconomic changes. Right? So these are things that involve economics, but also involve national defense, economic defense, and kind of geopolitics in general. These have shown up in places like trade, defense, and supply chains. And then the third one is, as you alluded to, Mike, the AI investment and opportunities. I might add risk there as well, but I'm a bit of an optimist. I'm going to talk about the first two, and then I'm going to leave it to the expert on AI to talk about AI. So this is sort of the most immediate thing that's happening to the economy, not just in the United States, but across the world. The red line is a measure of the price of oil, and the black line is a measure of inflation in the United States. And as you can see, oil prices have been sort of trending down since the beginning of last year. That blip up in May 2025 was the earlier operation in Iran. They've been kind of trending down, and then inflation had been sort of coming down since September. And then we see this very sharp uptick in both of those two series. And that's not a coincidence. As the price of oil sharply increased, so too has inflation in the US, right? So think about the CPI as measuring how much more expensive is a typical basket of goods consumed today versus a year ago. And you can see for April, that's up about 3.8% year over year. So driven mostly by the price of oil and other things that are affected by either the price of oil or by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So country, and this is not just a US phenomenon, countries across the world are facing inflationary pressures from this campaign. So we think about what's sort of at risk in the Straits. Certainly, oil is one that we've heard the most about. About 20% of the world's oil typically flows through the Strait of Hormuz. So this is a very large shock to oil, but it's much broader than that. Petroleum products, things like helium and other sort of gases, specialty gases that are used in high-end manufacturing, urea and ammonia, and these things show up in kind of everywhere, right? So they're in sectors all across the economy. Energy, obviously, is sort of the first thing people think about, but jet fuel is something that people are concerned about right now. Fertilizer, a lot of petroleum type products eventually become things that look like fertilizers, which is hitting sort of right as planting season in a lot of the United States is happening. Plastics, semiconductors, most of the world's economy in one way or another touches something that looks like petroleum product. So this is not just the price of gasoline going up, but it's the price of lots of things, including eventually possibly things like food. In the short term, so if the war doesn't last very long, the biggest thing that will come out of this will be inflation, which is what we're living through right now. This morning, the 30-year Treasury topped 5.2%. The yields, or the rate at which the U.S. government borrows on a 30-year bond, or that 30-year bond was trading at about 5.2%. So that's the highest it's been for decades, and that's being driven right now largely by inflation. Nominal interest rates have to reflect the fact that the money you're going to pay back in the future is worth less if there's inflation. So inflation and interest rates are tied together closely, and as Treasury yields start to move around, you'd expect to see mortgage yields move around, credit card yields. So these would eventually move through the economy, increasing both inflation and probably interest rates. In the long run, if this goes on long enough, the issue is that for now there was, at least at the beginning, in inventories in the world economy, right? This is everything from firms holding individual inventories of products they might use to the oil that was already on tanker ships sitting in the ocean. And so as we're running down those stocks of inventories, things are going to get tighter, prices will go higher, and you can eventually run into sort of shortages, kind of like people who are old enough will remember from the oil shocks in the 1970s. So for now, we're seeing something that looks like inflation. If this was to go on long enough, we might see something a little more harmful. So these are some forecasts done by the IMF, just to give you a sense of some of the scale here. So if you look at the red bars on the left-hand side, that's world GDP growth. On the right-hand side, that's inflation. So one a measure of output, another a measure of prices. The red bars are what the forecast looked like before the conflict started. And so GDP growth in 2026, about 3.5%, something kind of similar for 2027, with inflation rates at about almost 4% and about 3.5%. Then in April, they updated their forecast to this reference forecast. And you can see that in 2026, this would be, if the war kind of ends soon, it'll shave 0.5 point off of growth in 2026, not much at all in 2027, and have some inflationary effect in 2026 that will be sort of done by 2027 as markets renormalize. The gray and black bars show kind of worse scenarios where prices go up by more and the conflict lasts longer. And you can see there in the kind of worst case scenarios for 26, 27, GDP growth is down around 2% globally, and inflation is up near 6%. So this is really a question of how quickly the engagement can be wrapped up. And then even once it's wrapped up, you'd anticipate it being months probably before markets renormalize, right? To refill inventories and kind of renormalize prices. There's going to be some construction that has to happen in the area as well. It's been damaged during the fighting, so it will still take a little bit of time as well for things to bounce back. So I'm going to move past the Strait of Hormuz for now, and then just chat briefly about the geoeconomic pressures that I was talking about. There's lots of them. This is a really sort of big topic. Just three things I just want to sort of highlight. U.S. tariff policy has been a big issue in terms of reconfiguring the way that trade is operating. and then uncertainty around both U.S. trade policy and then policy in other countries are also contributing to some short-term disruption. Supply chain scrambles since at least 2022. Different things have been happening that have been disrupting global supply chains, and firms and governments have been working hard to try to build some supply chain resiliency, and that's also something that people are thinking about. And then defense spending. Defense spending has been up almost everywhere across the world, and that's driving both a fiscal stimulus in terms of spending, but also is going to run headlong into fiscal space, fiscal capacity. So yeah, I just want to point out a couple things here. So this is, you look at this black line, this is the share of U.S. imports that originate from China. You can see in early 2000s, as they were getting ready to join the WTO, that was about 8%. So about 8% of everything we imported came from China. That topped out at about 22% in 2015 or 2016. And then since the first Trump administration, that's sort of fallen now down to where today it's almost back to where it was before. And so that's been a sort of enormous change in the trading relationship between these two countries, and quite a decrease in the amount of imports the U.S. is getting from China. Now, the issue for the kind of broader global economy is that as China has exported less and less to the United States, it's continuing to export more and more overall. So in 2025, China's total exports grew almost 6%, even as they're kind of falling sharply to the United States. So the question is, where's all that going? And so here you can sort of see where Chinese export growth is happening as it's falling away from the United States and also from Russia, because it's gotten harder for them to do transactions. See, one of the big places this stuff is going is to the Southeast Asian economies. Part of that is just reconfiguring of supply chains. And instead of producing these goods in China, they're being produced in Vietnam or Cambodia, and then they're receiving inputs from China. But I think the more disruptive one in the sense of what has happened in the US is what might be happening in the EU. So the EU is now seeing an influx of goods from China, partially because of US trade policy, partially because of Chinese competitive forces that they're now having to grapple with. You might think of this as, talk about the China shock in the United States was the rapid increase in imports into the US that disrupted quite a bit of manufacturing capacity in the US. The EU now might be staring down China shock 2.0, where it's now trying to deal with imports of electric vehicles, which it's now increasing tariffs on, steel, which is increasing tariffs on, machinery, and just also trying to understand how to manage trade in a world that's changing. We're now there, sort of the residual claimant of Chinese supply. Then in the context of this supply chain, so I'd say sort of three things have happened in the last 5 years or so that have kind of brought renewed attention to the potential leverage and fragility of these international supply chains. So you can think that over the last 20 years, as advances in logistics have gotten better, as costs of communication have fallen, supply chains have become incredibly stretched and thin as they reach the very most efficient places they can. But then those build dependencies and leverage. And so we saw when Russia invaded Ukraine and cut off gas supplies to the EU, COVID-19, you'll probably remember lots of supply chain disruptions and things you could and couldn't get. And then last year, Chinese rare earth export controls, where shortages of rare earth magnets, for example, were shutting down automotive assembly lines and threatened lots of other manufacturing. So the goal then is to go out and rebuild more resilient supply chains, things that maybe you have multiple sources for, that you're bringing some production perhaps back into the country or to friendly countries. Stockpiling, government partnerships, plurilateral agreements on things. The U.S. last year signed some plurilateral agreements on rare earths and on some semiconductor technologies. And I'll just point out, given what we're about to talk about next, that the AI supply chain is incredibly complex and extremely global and vulnerable to a lot of these same things. Okay, this is my last slide. It's not quite something that that Mike had mentioned, but I think it's worth keeping in mind. This picture here is the change in government debt since 2019, and it's measured in percentage points of GDP. So if you look at the U.S., that says the U.S. has increased their debt to GDP ratio by about 16 percentage points. Went from about 109% of GDP to about 125% of GDP. And that's kind of happening in lots of countries. This is the result first of COVID bailouts and policies taken there, and then increases in spending on defense, increases in spending on social programs. And so as we're trying to figure out how to respond to different types of things happening in the world, as we're thinking about building larger armies, this is all happening at a time when government finances are already stressed. And so you've got increasing debt levels, you've got higher interest rates. This is potentially a problem, not just for the United States, but for many countries in the world. So let me end on that and turn it back over to you, Mike.
Fantastic. Thanks for setting the stage for us tonight, Kim. A lot of great information there, and I'm sure it will prompt a lot of audience questions, and I certainly made a nice list of my own, so we'll be back to you shortly. But next, let's bring up Patrick McDaniel from our computer science department. Fun fact, both of our guests tonight, their previous academic appointment was at Penn State. Patrick comes from the computer program at Penn State, which is in the engineering school, and Kim came to us 8 years ago from the economics department at Penn State. So a couple of Nittany Lions anchoring the show tonight. Patrick, tell us about how AI is reshaping the U.S. economy and the world.
Thanks, Mike, and it's a real pleasure to be here tonight. I think what I want to do is really address the question of essentially how do we perceive AI, and this is in the context of we all are in the midst of this revolution where AI is reshaping things like economic growth and jobs, global competition. And I think we'll take it as written that AI is a fundamentally disruptive technology. It's going to reshape many fields and has already done so in many, such as software. And so as it reshapes jobs, what we have to ask ourselves is what are those jobs actually going to look like? But really, I think I want to speak to the sense of uncertainty here, which is causing a lot of anxiety. And so I feel like there's some basic tenets that we sort of accept as truisms about AI that we should have some perspective on. And I'm going to propose these as three essential propositions. And the first one really has to do with humans. There's a lot of discussion around layoffs, and there's lots of publicity around companies that are laying off that are due to the AI, the introduction of AI technologies. This is particularly true in my field of computer science. I'm actually sitting here in San Francisco as we speak, and at a conference where we're discussing exactly what the impact on computer science this AI is going to be. But there is a fundamental paradox that we're facing in this advancing technology, or any technology. It's actually got an economic theory. It's called Jevons paradox. And it's actually what's referred to as a consumption paradox. And what it says is, as you become more efficient at using any resource, the reaction of the market is to use more of that resource. And in some sense, we can think of AI as an example of this. We have now unlocked a new technology in which we can use computers in new ways that simply weren't possible before. And I've been thinking about this for the last year, and I actually heard a comment from Judy Faulkner, who's the founder of Epic, who came and spoke at the university some weeks ago. And she said, the people that think we're all going to lose a huge number of jobs are perhaps not having the imagination to understand exactly what this new AI generation is going to bring. And in that, what she's really referring to is that, yes, things are going to change, but new jobs are going to open up because there are simply new possibilities. We're seeing this in things like the biofield, where new advances in AI are unlocking new kinds of highly accelerated development of things like personalized medicine and pharmaceuticals. And so as AI begins to advance, it's going to unlock huge new areas of endeavor, while perhaps taking some of the more mundane and making them less important. And so while we think of, this historically, think about when spreadsheets, for those of you old enough to remember when spreadsheets were introduced, there was this moment where everyone thought we wouldn't need accountants anymore. But as it turned out, we actually needed more accountants because things like spreadsheets and computerized bookkeeping allowed us to have a much richer set of tools on which to investigate finance. And so we're seeing that in many different fields. And this is actually backed up. The recent studies are beginning to show that some of these advances in AI have introduced whole new fields within things like application development, which has introduced whole new markets. And the second proposition I want to bring to the table is the inherent openness of AI. So one thing to know about AI is that artificial intelligence is not a single technique, but it's a body of techniques, which has been the culmination of about 50 years of research. And that set of technologies itself are widely studied within the scientific community. And to give you a sense of how open it is, there are public models that are developed by nonprofits and academics, which are available, which are only about 4 months behind the traditional or the big models that you'd see in somebody like an OpenAI or Anthropic or Google. And the reality is that as those companies are developing new kinds of models, it's very, very soon after those models and advances are made in the public domain. And so as Kim was talking about the AI supply chain being very difficult, the supply chain for models is actually fairly open. As people begin to use models and those models are exposed, the techniques underlying them are fairly well documented. And so what we're going to see is that the people that are building models for AI aren't necessarily the companies that are going to win the air quote the AI wars. Put another way, companies like ChatGPT and Anthropic are producing technology that can be not readily, but within a matter of months, reproduced by the public. And so what we're going to see as AI advances, the models that are available for essentially free to the public are going to become more and more powerful, and the economic differentiator of these larger companies are going to diminish. But where this really is going to be the companies that are more likely to be the really dominant players in this new AI age, one could argue, are going to be the ones that are going to be providing the infrastructure for performing the AI. These large data centers are going to be the utilities for AI. You will need to use these large scale utilities to practice AI, even though the models themselves may not be, or the software may not be, or may be readily available. And so what we'll see is that these companies will be profitable to some degree, but the really profitable companies are the ones that are going to provide the hardware to actually implement AI. Now, the last proposition I would put forward is really has to do with perception of people in the city that I'm in. I've spent a fair bit of time over the last 10 years in Silicon Valley. And there's this common perception that the rejection of AI is due to fear. I think we've all read over the weekend, there were a couple of graduation ceremonies where people, the speakers were bringing up AI and the students booed them. In fact, there was a study, I believe it was in the New York Times this morning, that said about 18% of Gen Z folks have a positive outlook on AI. And I think this notion that they're afraid of jobs and they're afraid it's gonna lead them down a dark economic path sort of miscalculates where many people in Gen Z are. And I've had this experience talking to students, particularly those here at the University of Wisconsin. And the fundamental reason they're rejecting AI is they don't trust it, and they shouldn't. And so to give you a parallel, I'd like you to think about when search was first introduced to the internet around 2000. So originally you had the Yahoos and things like that, and then Google came along, and they have this magic algorithm called PageRank, which provided very quickly access to the links that were most important to your search. However, in the next 25 years or so, search has really morphed. Now, if you put a request into a search engine, that request will then be handed off and interpreted by a bunch of financial arrangements. And whoever will bid the largest amount of money to provide links to you will decide what links you actually see. And so while originally there was this egalitarian nature of search was simply you put in a request and it gave you the answers which was most relevant, it has become a bidding war over your attention. And so what we will see in the AI community and what the Gen Zers have experienced over the last 25 or 30 years is that we will see this in AI. AI will not necessarily provide you the best AI services for you as a consumer. The concern is that the AI will provide the best monetization of you as a consumer that works in the best interests of the companies. And we've seen this over and over again, where big tech has provided technology after technology after technology, which even at the beginning may have had some very positive effects. Over time, some of the advantages of those technologies have degraded. And we've seen this in, for example, search, social media. We've seen this in mobile systems where the systems themselves have begun to work against the best interest of those consumers. And so we're likely to see this in the AI space. And it's even going to be more complicated because people who are providing these AI services are going to be in the position where they have information that you don't. So this information asymmetry will allow them to potentially manipulate the user in ways that won't be transparent. And so this rejection of AI is a fear that the same kinds of services or the misuse of those services against the consumer's best interest will play out in AI. And so in sum, these three propositions really tell us a broader story, that we are in a moment where the AI is going to become more and more important of a tool. It is not simply it is affecting markets, but it's not going to fundamentally reshape the needs of things like the technology community in a way that obviates the need for a large number of computer scientists. And at the same time, we're going to see people having a lot of wariness to the use of AI. And so as we look to this as it affects things like jobs and global competition, yes, it will be important for the next generation of users to know something about AI. But we have to be really careful about the hype and taking the assertions of big tech's promises of a utilitarian utilization and utility with in a way that makes the user accept these technologies without reservation. So thank you.
Patrick, thank you. Yeah, I want to come to you with a question right away.
Sure.
About AI. And it's simply this, we are launching our new School of Computing and Artificial Intelligence. Congratulations. You played a role in launching that, I know, because you were one of the key people as the study team that we convened from around the country. We brought in some of the leaders of computer science departments around the country to give advice to the administration here at Wisconsin. I know you were very involved with that process. Tell me, given the resources of the big players in the AI revolution, how is it that universities are going to be particularly relevant and important to the development of artificial intelligence and its impact on the economy? Talk a little bit about that. What's our role?
So I think the role of the university in the advancement of AI will remain the same it has been for forever in the scientific community, in the technology community, and even in the humanities, and that is that there are basic fundamental needs for science that do not have the shorter term economic upside that makes it viable for companies to expend on. We have, for example, the University of Wisconsin, one of the strongest theoretical artificial intelligence groups in the world here, who are studying the mathematics of the finest tuning of that AI, which some of this work takes literally decades to play out and requires sophisticated mathematicians and statisticians, which are really the university's main business. This long-term fundamental research is where we are going to see its major role. And at the same time, we are the engines of innovation. You set loose hundreds of 20-somethings with a technology like AI, and they don't know what they don't know. And that's where real innovation comes. And we'll see, particularly as we invest in this new college in entrepreneurial activities, we're going to see the research activities and the undergraduate education activities lead to these new companies and be the genesis of new technologies that simply wouldn't happen within the constraints of an industrial environment.
Thank you, Patrick. Is Kim back in? Great. Kim, welcome back. Great to have you both here tonight. Kim, I want to ask you a little bit about Liberation Day. It seemed like the motivation for Liberation Day tariffs had a lot to do with the bilateral trade imbalances between the United States and its trading partners. But since Liberation Day, some of those trade policies have been undone. They've been brought back in other forms. Can you just bring us up to date on where do the tariff policies stand today? And what do you think is the motivation for the tariff policies? Does it have to do with supply chain risks and reducing the risk of supply chains by making us more self-reliant? And is the United States really big enough to be self-reliant? If China's our competitor, they have an extra billion people. I think they have a better chance of being self-reliant than we do. But give me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, happy to. Certainly, if you're not getting paid poorly as a government official to keep track of this, you probably have lost the thread a bit. The tariffs from April 2 of last year were passed under a tariffing authority called the IEEPA, which was then overturned by the Supreme Court back in February. Since then, temporary tariff measures have been put in place that sort of form a stopgap while the administration works on longer-term, more legally durable tariffs. So I think the best way to think about the motivation for these parts of the tariff code are as a way to create leverage to negotiate new trade deals. And that's sort of what's been happening. Right? We've seen the EU, the UK, Japan, Korea. This has been a renegotiation of trade with these countries. We'll see a renegotiation between the US, Mexico, and Canada going on more or less right now as USMCA is up for its review this year. You mentioned a second potential motivation, one about supply chains and about economic security. Those are certainly motivators, being used, though, often different types of tools than the ones that happened on April 2, and ones that probably don't get as much publicity. And these are things like Section 232 tariffs, which are a different tariffing code that singles out specific goods like semiconductors or rare earths or polysilicon, and then tries to create conditions to bring maybe manufacture of that back to the U.S. or potentially towards an aligned country. We also have things such as export controls. So this is something I bet Patrick has thought a lot about. One of the most important export controls, or one of the most certainly written about ones, are on semiconductors, particularly things like NVIDIA chips to China, which is, of course, a major input into actually applying AI models. And so, there's a package of different policies that are being used. This goes on, including policies that started in the Biden administration, like the CHIPS Act or the IRA, that have all been sort of towards trying to build more resilient supply chains.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the trade policies really aren't necessarily aimed at getting rid of trade deficits, but to bring us to the negotiating table to get better arrangements than we've had in the past.
Yeah, I think that's what the outcomes have been. Yeah, we've been able to, and yes, an old international economist, Mike, retired maybe, I guess, that these are not trade deals in the sense of the WTO, where we just sort of bargain over tariffs and then we're done. These are much broader. They're aimed at non-tariff barriers, digital service taxes, which are basically taxes on U.S. companies trying to sell abroad. Agreements to buy soybeans and Boeing jets and military equipment from the U.S. So these are much broader based deals than the sort of narrow tariff negotiations that we've often undertaken in the past.
And you couldn't get the foreign countries to buy some seats in graduate programs at the University of Wisconsin?
They didn't let me to the table, Mike. I would have been all over.
All right, okay. Patrick J. Finkel has a question that I think I'll direct to you, which is, how do you see the ROI for the massive investments needed for AI and the data centers to support it? So is this really going to turn out to be, will it support the kind of valuations that we've seen for these companies? And is the U.S. maybe at greater risk of an AI bubble than the rest of the world? That was another audience question tonight.
Sure, and let me say at the outset, I'm not an economist, so I'll do my best.
But you played one on the live stream earlier.
Yeah, that's fair enough. So yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing a shakeout. We will see a shakeout of the AI community. There is a tremendous amount of investment. I was just at a conference here in San Francisco about a month ago called RASC, which is the cybersecurity conference, and the entire conference was 30,000 people selling products of AI security, and it was incredible to watch. And there will be some winners and losers. I think people are putting down some big bets. I think there is the ROI for AI will be very market driven, very vertical driven. There are some things like the software industry is currently going probably the biggest change in its history, where we're seeing productivity gains in traditional programming pipelines that are just astonishing. But they're not. We're seeing that immediately. We're seeing this in things like traditional biomedical research and pharmaceutical research. We're going to see this in medicine. But there are other areas where we're seeing sort of the use of AI haven't really found a really great test case. A lot of the sort of back office stuff, I think, is actually we're going to see a lot of ROI. Getting to your question about whether the massive investments we're seeing in sort of, we'll call them the big three, Google, Anthropic, and OpenAI, for trying to keep a leg up on who has the best version of AI. And if you look back over the last 2 years, sort of when ChatGPT came out, OpenAI was really the leader and nobody could catch them. And then for a brief time, Google with its Gemini system, they were the leader. And now Anthropic is having their moment. We're going to see that change over time. I would come back to one of my principles, which is that the AI itself is accelerating, and it's so so readily open that it's not clear to me that there is a clear market for a differentiable market for AI as a service, the way that ChatGPT and Anthropic are actually set up. I think this is just my opinion, is the companies that are going to win are going to look at AI as, again, I'll come back to this, AI as a utility. Where can I provide the platforms to drive these complex computations, which is going to be Amazon is traditionally, AWS kind of dominates that market in the traditional computation space. They're starting to dominate that space. Google, with their massive framework, is in a position to sort of win the data center wars. I think those are the sure bets in my mind, rather than the model-based companies. And then, Google, if we're talking about the market, there's an argument to be made that Google never has to make a penny from AI because they have tremendous other data source of money coming through things like advertising, whereas Anthropic and OpenAI are going to have to make a profit soon because people are putting massive amounts of dollars in it. And so you've got an asymmetry where somebody has a war chest and two other companies don't. And as a matter of simple economic theory, I think that puts them at a distinct advantage that historically somebody like Google has not been shy about exploiting.
Interesting, but sometimes necessity is the mother of invention. So we'll see how it plays out. I'm going to stick with you for another question. You talked about the human capital fallacy and how spreadsheets created a need for more accountants. One of the areas that people have talked about where maybe AI will put a dent in the labor market is the legal profession. And of course, today I read an article on Bloomberg about the billionaires that have been created from the AI revolution. Among them, two guys, roommates, I think a law student and a computer science student, started a little company that can do all the work of kind of an entry-level legal associate, do all the research. And that seems like a bit of a counterexample. And to one of the questions we got, it's certainly an example of the use of AI in the public domain. Are there instances where you think AI really will do a pretty good job of replacing certain entry-level white-collar jobs?
So this is so the legal profession is sort of the great example of this. So the product of the legal profession is highly structured, highly data-driven documents which make structured arguments that comply with a set of constraints, which is a long way to say is basically a legal brief is just an argument that applies legal precedent and uses a very structured and very knowable language. And so those are things that if you look at a lot of legal documents, you can create AI that can produce new legal documents. So that's one where I strongly believe that they're going to have, that's one area that's going to be affected by this. We're going to see things like the marketing profession is actually going to get hit by this. I mean, we're already seeing this. So things where we're producing artifacts which are highly structured and highly sort of learnable and predictable in a sort of rinse and repeat. Yes. Things that require more innovation. There is an upside, to take a step back. Their use of AI is going to open up so much more opportunity for innovation and service. We're going to see perhaps a huge number of new teachers and a huge number of new nurses and things like that may come out of this revolution. We may find, if you want to take the glass half full, look at AI and say the new renaissance is we actually get to start being more of service to each other, and we let AI take care of a lot of the more mundane things.
Thank you. Kim, I'm going to shift over to you and return to a point that you mentioned earlier, and that's about reshoring and friendshoring. I might want to know who our friends are at this point, but that's a different lane altogether. But we got a question directed at me, but I'll let you answer it. I made a comment that with a billion more people, it's a little bit easier for China to be somewhat more self-reliant than the United States. I mean, that is a very, large economies often can be more self-reliant and less engaged on a percentage basis in trade. But he was asking for a little bit of expansion on that point. Is that really true? And then talk a little bit about the reshoring and friendshoring and what's driving that. What are the U.S. policies that are driving toward reshoring and friendshoring, and how important is the friendshoring given our size as an economy?
Right. So the U.S. has traditionally been a pretty closed economy. We don't import and export much, partially because we are this, maybe not as large as China in terms of number of people, but we're a large, very productive economy. We have mineral resources. We have good farmland. We have an ocean on either side of us. There's a lot of things that have led the U.S. to be actually a fairly self-reliant economy for a long time. And it's really only been in the last 20 or 30 years where we've seen a sort of real movement away from that. And so, I think, nobody thinks that it's, we need to bring back flip-flop manufacturing to the United States, or that, we need to be necessarily making Barbie dolls here or something. So I think what's important is to think about what are the goods that are important, that we have some sort of control over, whether that's control within our own country or in an aligned country. And these are the sorts of goods that you would need in an emergency, that you would need in a war. Frankly, lots of very important things: steel, aluminum, rare earths are all things that we used to produce here. And then for solid economic purposes, in terms of comparative advantage, we do less of. And then sometimes for not necessarily economic ideas, but because of state subsidization, financial repression, other policies in countries that have made some of these industries sort of concentrate in places like, say, China or other places. Friendshoring, what are we talking about? We're talking about producing in countries that we think will be there, that we can have access to, and that will be aligned with us in one of these emergencies. And you talked a bit about, or you alluded to, who are our friends and not. That's first. I'll let the State Department sort of work that out. But traditionally, Europe, Canada, Japan, Australia. These are all countries that have a lot of the things that we all need and are willing to sort of work together on. So I give you two good examples of this, both of which are related to the kinds of things we need to do high-tech manufacturing and semiconductors. One is the plurilateral agreements on rare earths that involve Japan, Australia, Korea, and a host of other countries who are all want to work together in order to rebuild capacity to produce these goods. And then the second one is something called Pax Silica, which is, again, a plurilateral agreement basically on the AI supply chain. So everything from the rare earths and gases and things that you need in order to make chips, all the way up through the kind of AI technology and software and stack. And that involves countries in the Middle East, as well as other countries that might have, kind of traditionally have been part of these agreements. And so these are the places where I think there's a lot of ability to kind of have these agreements that are more focused on important things that these economies all realize they need, rather than the big all-encompassing sort of deals that we might have done in the past.
Great, thank you. Kim, I'm going to stick with you on this question from Thomas Zeise. Does the global increase in defense spending, which, obviously precipitated by, I think, some of the uncertainty about the U.S. commitment to NATO and, just where the world is headed, does that global increase in defense spending, will that significantly impact inflation on consumer goods? And if so, will that be long-term or transitory? Because it does seem like there is a significant overlap in certainly the material resources needed for a big increase in defense spending. It seems like it's going to compete with other uses. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, part of what makes some of the stuff we just talked about understanding what goods we need and are willing to to go for, is that a lot of these are dual use goods. I mean, AI is exactly a dual use good. You can use it to write legal contracts, or you can use it to do intelligence gathering for the Air Force, something like that. So a lot of these things are going to certainly have two uses. I think the bigger question in terms of inflation and other outcomes are how governments finance all of this, all of the uptick in defense spending. Right? Where are they going to find the space to spend more money on defense when they've already, not quite maxed out their credit card, when they're already carrying significant debt? And so, if what happens is governments go out and spend even more on borrowing, interest rates will go up, and that will tend to cause problems in economies. In terms of consumer prices themselves, you'll probably see some specific ones, but if we spend $1 trillion on defense in the U.S., which is the sort of number we're talking about, that's still 1/30 of what we spend in the entire country. So I could imagine it's going to show up for some specific kind of narrow things, but probably not particularly some broad-based inflation measure. I'd be much more worried about what's happening with debt levels and interest rates.
Great perspective. Thank you. We have another question. I'm going to stick with you. Well, actually, let me go to Patrick on this one. Are the fears of future job losses created by AI any different than the jobs lost in the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago or 150 years ago? It seems like we always end up with more net jobs over time.
Yeah, yes, and I think that's exactly Javon's paradox. Is that as the technology is introduced, it will create a need for more of the people that work in that space. But speaking to the Industrial Revolution, there was a transition from agrarian to an industrial economy and base of jobs, and so there were people that accepted that transition and made the transition, and there were those that don't. Those people that are not interested in being retrained or learning to redo their jobs or embracing the new tools are going to be less employable. And so there's going to be a potential that there's going to be a generation of folks that if they're not embracing these new sets of tools, they're just not going to be competitive in the market for these jobs. And so the fear isn't necessarily that there will be fewer jobs. There will actually be more jobs, as an economic theory says, but there will be a need for those people who have current jobs and have a certain set of skill sets to really re-up. And this is a place where potentially the University of Wisconsin can really make a difference. If we can make a concerted effort for the people of Wisconsin to create those opportunities to help people in upgrading those skills. And in fact, I was just in a meeting with Extension, University of Wisconsin Extension, where exactly these sorts of conversations are starting to happen.
Thank you. Gary Lensmeyer wonders, how do you see AI taking away jobs of financial planners and investment brokers?
Well, I think I'd probably like to leave that question to Kim, but I think what we're going to see is, and I think the big concern is across a lot of disciplines, sort of the entry-level jobs where you spend several years learning the plumbing, the mechanics of your industry, you learn the ebbs and flows. Some of those jobs will go to AI, and we're going to perhaps be at a deficit because we won't have the learning ability. We won't have the learning opportunities for people to become senior. And so, yes, potentially some of those early stage jobs, particularly ones that are sort of paper oriented and moving from place to place and doing things like scheduling and doing customer relations and things like that, those jobs will be affected. But the financial industry and all industries are going to have to ask themselves, if we lose that first 5 or first 10 years of experience from junior folks, how are we going to reproduce the leaders and the skill sets to allow us to get to the mid-tier and the top tier for those industries?
Thank you. Thomas Gracia is back about the self-reliance point. He's quibbling with the moderator because China is an export-driven economy, and that's a great point, Thomas. But I would say both China and the U.S. today are fairly insular economies. China imports anywhere from 14 to 17% of its GDP, which is not a lot compared to European Union countries or and such. And it's not so different from the US. But my point is simply, when you have 1.4 billion people, you can probably be good in artificial intelligence and technology and still have a lot of people working in agriculture, et cetera. Large numbers of people allow a country to do a lot more for itself. But as Kim noted, I think the US, from a resource standpoint, is situated better than China with its natural resource bounty, and China's had to go to other countries to kind of control the market in rare earths. I don't know, Kim, do you have thoughts about that?
Yes, I largely agree with everything you said. And also, though, this goes back to Patrick's point, which is, it kind of fits both, which is we're also a very productive country. So we don't really we need very few people to feed ourselves nowadays, right? Like, I want to say with what Patrick's been talking about, 400 years ago, we were all farmers. And now almost none of us are farmers, but we all found other things to do with our time.
And we still have a lot of food.
And we yes, as my doctor would tell me, there's plenty of food. I think the way to think about it is what these things tend to do is change the composition of jobs, what jobs we're doing, rather than maybe the overall number of jobs. We've seen several, revolutions. We've seen the Industrial Revolution, electricity, the internet and computers, and now possibly, what's coming with the AI. And those were all very general purpose, disruptive technologies. As Patrick's given us several good examples of jobs that kind of don't really exist anymore. But then we find new things to do, new ways to sort of harness human creativity. I will just say that one thing I think that matters is the speed at which these transitions happen. And so, for example, electricity required building out electrical grids. It took time to get electricity to the entire world and for that to take shape. It took time to harness the steam engine. It took time to do these things. I don't claim to be an AI specialist, but I know that I use AI by logging onto the internet, and we have now built the internet, right? That a lot of that infrastructure is in place. I know there's a lot of data centers to be built probably and things like that, but is potentially could be a quick transition, which might make it more disruptive than a slower moving, but still, very transformative technology.
So if you don't mind, I'd love to follow on to that.
I would love that. And we will let this be the closing comment on our program because we're coming to the top of the hour. So Kim, thank you. And Patrick, take it away.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think the composition is there. I think the velocity issue of how these jobs change and how industries change is really not quite as settled as people think it is. While the capability is there, we still don't fundamentally understand the risks, the organizational risks. For example, we see this I was just having a discussion with some people who work in chemical engineering, and they're seeing like, oh, this AI can do really, really great things. But if you're running a chemical production facility, it can run great 500 times, but that 501st time it blows up. That's a problem, right? And so there's some risk assessment. We haven't actually figured out the engineering around AI. We have to put guardrails around AI to make sure it does not do unsafe things. And so I think there's a whole science and a whole engineering around this space that has to happen for industries to be able to safely integrate this AI. And so I think there's this notion, hey, we can just kind of sprinkle AI on and we're suddenly a new industry. I think we really want to put a pause on that, because when I go and talk to people who are working in areas where you have some critical infrastructure, or you have things that affect humans or profitability, people are very wary of putting AI in the pipeline because they don't really understand what the risks are.
That is a great point for us to conclude on. Thank you both for a great show tonight. We covered a lot of ground about what's going on in the economy. I mean, I do think there are a lot of inflationary forces out there, but there are also very powerful productivity enhancing forces coming through with AI. And I think there's a real battle going on right now between, all the policy change and the things that look a little bit inflationary on that side, which maybe once we get through them, they're not long-term inflationary, and then the artificial intelligence revolution that could deliver real benefits in productivity and keep inflation down and growth up. So we'll be watching that. Thank you both for a great show, and pleasure to have you with us tonight.
Thanks,
and
Mike.
Thank you to our audience. Great questions and comments tonight, as always. And we will be back next month with yet another show covering timely and important topics with UW experts. Thank you, and on Wisconsin.